He told her to step aside. She didn't. So she smiled and poured orange juice on his bag instead. That was the moment the mask dropped, and everyone in first class saw what she really thought of boys like them. She thought they'd sit there and take it. She thought they had no one. She was wrong. This isn't just a story about two black teens being harassed midair. It's about what happens when power underestimates silence, when cruelty comes dressed as policy, when someone mistakes skin color for status. The flight began like any other. White linens, hushed voices, a cabin curated for comfort, and an unspoken rule about who looks like they belong there. But today, that rule's about to be broken. Because the moment she targeted the wrong passengers, she triggered something no one on board could stop. Not the crew, not the company, not even herself. What you're about to witness isn't a flight. It's a reckoning at 30,000 feet. And by the time we land, the one who thought she was in charge won't even have a job to go back to. So buckle up, watch closely, and before you dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? What moment do you think will break her? And if you believe in justice that hits harder than words, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the conversation. This is just the beginning. The sun spilled golden light across the tarmac, casting long shadows through the airport windows as the luxury carrier prepared for takeoff. Inside Gate 11A, time moved slower, quieter, filtered through the calm, clinical polish of an exclusive airline lounge. Crystal water dispensers hummed softly, jazz played faintly overhead, and the air held that scent of privilege, leather, lavender sanitized surfaces, and unspoken judgment. At the gate podium, flight attendant Rebecca Monroe reviewed the final first-class manifest, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the tablet screen with sharp, precise rhythm. For Rebecca, first class wasn't merely a cabin, it was a curated experience, and she took pride in safeguarding it. Her territory was lined with champagne flutes, designer carry-ons, and a strict, if unspoken, hierarchy of who belonged. So when two young black teenagers approached the boarding line, one tall and still, the other with a subtle limp and a maroon birthmark that curved across his cheek like a shadow, Rebecca's gaze tightened by instinct alone. They didn't hesitate, didn't falter, didn't look around as if seeking permission. The taller boy handed her the boarding passes with quiet, composed confidence. 2A and 2B, he said. Thank you. She didn't smile. Her eyes narrowed, her tone light but laced with condescension. You gentlemen may want to check again. These seats are reserved for our premier passengers. The younger one blinked, confused but polite. These are the seats. We're Group 1. Rebecca paused for just a beat too long, glancing down again at the names, Micah Ellis and Elijah Ellis. The barcode scanned clean, the reservation confirmed, but her gut churned anyway. I see, she said, lips curling into a practiced smile. I wasn't aware the charity seat lottery included minors now. The airline has gotten generous. Elijah's grip tightened slightly on his bag, but Micah stepped forward, unbothered. We purchased these tickets 6 weeks ago. He didn't raise his voice, didn't blink. Rebecca's, I twitched at the boy's self-control. Then I suppose the airline standards have changed. Her tone was quiet enough to seem professional, but loud enough to be heard by the older man behind them in line, a silver-haired executive who chuckled under his breath. First time in the big leagues, he muttered. The boys didn't respond. They walked past Rebecca and entered the aircraft, their back straight, the limp in Elijah's step now drawing subtle stares from the other boarding passengers. Rebecca watched them settle into 2A and 2B, still half hoping some error would appear on the system, some final justification for what her gut had insisted. They didn't belong there. Her breath caught when Micah opened the overhead bin and tucked in a perfectly tailored leather briefcase. Not flashy, but not cheap. Nothing about them was. Yet that only fueled her irritation. She stormed down the jet bridge with the efficiency of someone deeply disturbed by something she couldn't name aloud. At the front galley, she whispered sharply to a younger attendant, Natalie. Did you see who just boarded into 2A and 2B? Natalie, confused, checked the manifest. The Ellis boys, she asked, then caught the look on Rebecca's face. Is there a problem? Rebecca scoffed quietly. No. Just making sure the airline isn't running a school bus through my cabin." She left before Natalie could respond. As boarding continued, Rebecca resumed her role. Smiles for the regulars, warm greetings for the known names. "Welcome back, Mr. Wainwright," she said to a banker she recognized, then turned and offered only a nod as she passed Micah and Elijah. Both were seated, silent. Elijah looked out the window. Micah's posture hadn't changed, arms folded, expression unreadable. Rebecca hovered nearby, inspecting their row without cause, lingering long enough to make it uncomfortable. Then she stepped forward, voice tight. "Please be careful with those shoes," she said to Elijah, gesturing to where his foot touched the back of the seat in front. "The leather scuffs easily." Elijah blinked. "Sorry." He moved his foot slightly, clearly aware of his leg's stiffness. Rebecca didn't move. "If you need extra space, there are comfort kits in the bin. Just don't shift too much." "Yes, ma'am," Elijah said, but the edge in his tone wasn't lost on her. Micah didn't say a word, but Rebecca could feel his stare. She returned to the galley again, her stomach now nodding. Not with guilt, with unease. Something about the silence of those boys unsettled her. They hadn't argued. They hadn't escalated. That made them unpredictable. She preferred it when people got defensive. It gave her ammunition. This was something else. As the final boarding call rang out and the doors prepared to close, she made a final walk through the cabin. Her smile was intact again, her tone warm. But when she passed 2A and 2B, she didn't speak. She didn't offer water or a menu or even eye contact. Just a glance, clinical and cutting. Micah looked at her just once. He didn't smile, didn't blink. Rebecca turned away before she could feel anything. Rebecca Monroe resumed her professional smile as she moved down the aisle, offering flutes of sparkling wine to the regulars, exchanging inside jokes with high-tier travelers who liked to be remembered. Yet with every step closer to 2A and 2B, her demeanor sharpened, and the air around her shifted. She approached the Ellis boys with a tray balanced gracefully on one hand, her voice sugar-laced. "Sparkling water, orange juice, or champagne?" she asked, though the smile never reached her eyes. Micah politely declined. Elijah, still slightly stiff from a limp, nodded and said softly, "Orange juice, please." Rebecca handed over the glass with a tilt more aggressive than necessary. The cup wobbled as she released it just a split second early. Bright liquid sloshed forward and splattered across the edge of the tray table and directly onto Elijah's leather bag, staining the worn brown flap in vivid streaks. There was a pause, a collective inhale from the nearby rows, but Rebecca spoke first. "Oh dear," she said with exaggerated concern, already reaching for a napkin but making no move to truly help. "You must have bumped the tray with your foot. These aisles are a little tight for someone who moves around." Her tone didn't need to finish the sentence. Elijah blinked, his face falling slightly as he tried to wipe the juice with the cheap napkin she handed him. The stain was already setting. "I didn't touch it," he murmured. "I was sitting still." "Well," she said breezily, ignoring his defense, "let's just try to be more careful, yes?" She turned without apology, continuing up the aisle as if nothing had happened, leaving a faint sticky trail and a shrinking sense of dignity behind her. Micah leaned in toward Elijah, voice low. "Let it go." Elijah nodded, but his fingers tightened around the edge of his seat, knuckles white. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Rebecca returned, this time holding a digital scanner and a clipboard. "We're doing a final safety verification," she announced to the entire cabin, but her steps stopped only at row 2. "Gentlemen, I need you to briefly stand." Micah raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem?" "Routine," she said sweetly. "FAA audits us sometimes, and I like to stay ahead of the curve." The boys rose, reluctantly. Rebecca leaned in, pretending to inspect the underseat area and safety vests, taking far longer than necessary. She muttered, tapping her stylus against the wall. "Legroom's tight. Might need to document this seating zone in the incident log." She glanced back up at Elijah, still feeling stable. "Han? The way your foot caught earlier gave me concern." Elijah didn't respond. He only sat back down, This time slower, more careful. You may need to remain upright when the meal trays come through, she added pointedly. Wouldn't want another accident. Then to Micah, she added with mock cheer. You planning to stay in this seat the whole flight? Or should I chalk out a few options on the carpet for you? Micah's jaw flexed, but he kept his voice even. We're fine where we are. Good, she replied, lips tight. We like consistency in first class. She moved on before he could respond. Several passengers were watching now, but most pretended not to. It was the kind of confrontation you didn't want to involve yourself in, not because you didn't care, but because you didn't know whose side to be on. Rebecca knew this silence well. She'd worked her way up in the industry, learning exactly how far she could go before a complaint would stick. As long as she kept her tone sweet and her actions just within protocol, she could twist the line and never be held accountable. At the galley, Natalie hesitated, glancing down the aisle. You sure about how you're handling them? She asked quietly. They're not doing anything wrong. Rebecca shot her a warning look. You're still in your first year, Natalie. Trust me, if we don't keep the bar where it should be, it won't be first class anymore. Natalie turned away, lips pressed thin, but said nothing. Meanwhile, in C2A, Micah sat stiffly, hands folded in his lap, staring ahead like stone. Elijah pulled his bag closer, avoiding eye contact. His earlier excitement dulled into a tight, careful silence. The joy of flying had been replaced by the math of endurance. How many more hours? How many more tests of restraint? Rebecca reappeared moments later with dinner menus, smiling brightly at everyone, handing thick, leather-bound booklets down the aisle like a hostess at a fine restaurant. But when she reached the Ellis brothers, she paused, then set down a single economy-class snack pack, crackers, cheese cubes, a sealed plastic cup of water, and said, "This might be more appropriate for young travelers. The adult menu can be a bit intense." Micah didn't look at her. Elijah blinked, unsure how to respond. She didn't wait for one. "Enjoy your flight," she chirped and turned. A soft chime sounded overhead, signaling the start of the in-flight meal service, and Rebecca Monroe adjusted her silk scarf in the galley mirror before stepping into the aisle with a practiced glide. Her composure was flawless, every movement designed to project elegance and control. But beneath that smooth veneer, her mood had curdled into something colder, sharper. The Ellis boys, still seated quietly in 2A and 2B, hadn't risen to her provocations, and that annoyed her more than she cared to admit. They didn't protest, didn't complain, didn't make a scene. They just sat there, too calm, too polite, too silent. And that silence had begun to feel like defiance. She moved down the aisle with her meal cart, her smile perfectly in place for the familiar faces. "Braised short ribs or lemon-dill salmon, mister?" "Wainwright," she asked sweetly, already knowing his preference. "The short ribs, thank you," he replied, not even looking up from his tablet. Rebecca nodded, plated his selection with care, then continued forward. Though when she reached row 2, she deliberately paused just long enough for others to watch. "For our younger passengers," she said, her voice slightly raised, "we have a special menu. Macaroni and cheese with apple slices or chicken nuggets with sweet peas." Elijah blinked in surprise, unsure how to respond. Micah stared at her without a word. Rebecca gave a small, patronizing smile. "We like to make sure our junior travelers are comfortable." "We'll take the regular menu," Micah said evenly. "We're not children." Rebecca tilted her head. "I understand, but this option might be more suitable. Less sodium, easier to digest." She placed the children's trays in front of them anyway, then added with a quiet chuckle, "Besides, sometimes people need meals that match their experience and budget." She moved on before either of them could reply, but the damage had landed exactly where she intended. A few rows behind, someone gave a small laugh. Elijah didn't touch his food. Micah set the tray aside without a word. 10 minutes passed in silence, broken only by the soft rustle of wrappers and forks against china. Then, barely audible, Elijah chuckled at something on the in-flight screen. Just a breath of laughter, reflexive and quiet. It should have gone unnoticed. But Rebecca was already watching. She turned on her heel and approached with that same plastic smile, voice gentle but cutting. "Is everything all right here?" I just want to remind everyone that first class is a serene space. We do our best to maintain a calming environment for all our guests." She didn't look at Elijah when she said it. She looked at the couple across the aisle, inviting their judgment, pulling them in. "Some people," she added softly, almost conspiratorially, "haven't yet learned how to behave around adults." The woman in 2D raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Her husband gave a small grunt of agreement. Elijah's smile had disappeared. His hands went to his lap, tightening around the napkin, as if willing himself to vanish. Micah didn't speak, but his jaw clenched, and he leaned slightly forward, elbows on knees. Rebecca watched for another beat, then turned, pleased with the shift in atmosphere. She knew the feeling, control returning like breath after holding it too long. Back in the galley, Natalie glanced at the stack of untouched regular meal trays still on the counter. "Why didn't you offer them the full menu?" she asked cautiously. Rebecca didn't look up from wiping the counter. "Did you see them?" she replied dryly. "Those seats were probably gifted or won in some promo." Natalie frowned. "So, they still deserve the same options as everyone else." Rebecca finally met her eyes. "This is first class, not public transit. Presentation matters. Harmony matters." Natalie looked like she might argue, but another chime overhead drew them back to duty. Meanwhile, the air around the Ellis brothers had grown heavier. Elijah stared blankly at the screen, no longer watching. Micah sat stiff and still, his mind somewhere distant. The confidence he'd worn at boarding had fractured, chipped away by Rebecca's relentless performance of politeness laced with venom. First class had never been about luxury. It was about signals. Elijah sat hunched, shoulders drawn inward, hands resting on his lap, his untouched children's meal tray already pushed to the side. Micah sat taller, but only just. The restraint in his jaw had turned from quiet tension to something carved out of stone. For the past 30 minutes, no flight attendant had approached their row except to collect trash. No water refills, no small talk, no second offers. They had become a void in the service pattern, seen but never served. And yet, that wasn't enough for Rebecca Monroe. From the galley, she watched them again, her eyes narrowing as Elijah reached up slowly, self-consciously, and scratched his cheek near the birthmark that stretched like a faded scar beneath his left eye. He didn't do it dramatically. He wasn't seeking attention. It was just a brief motion, quick, discreet, the kind people made without thinking. But Rebecca saw it, and in that moment, something in her latched on. With a practiced glide, she walked back to their row, then stopped just a bit too close. Her voice, when it came, was no longer hidden behind subtlety. "Excuse me," she said, tone sharp with concern yet pitched high enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Is that a skin condition? If you're experiencing something contagious, we need to alert the crew." Elijah froze, hand still halfway in the air. "No, it's not," he said, voice thin. "It's a birthmark." Rebecca didn't blink. It's best if passengers disclose anything that might pose a discomfort or risk to others, especially in an enclosed environment. Micah spoke now, quiet but steady. "He's not sick. You know that." Rebecca's lips curled into a neutral smile, but her eyes were cold. "We don't make assumptions about health on this aircraft. We follow protocol, and protocol says any visible abnormality must be assessed." Her gaze flicked to the couple across the aisle, as if inviting their discomfort to validate her concern. The woman looked down. The man looked away. Rebecca straightened, smoothing her uniform. "For the comfort of others, I'll be filing a cabin condition notice. It's purely procedural." Without asking, she pulled out a clipboard and began writing. Micah's voice dropped an octave. "That's not procedure. That's harassment." Rebecca didn't respond. She clicked her pen once, twice, 3 times, then reached into a pouch and pulled out a standard form. "This is a voluntary seat reassignment form," she said casually. "Sometimes, when certain guests feel unwell or aren't receiving the best possible experience, they're given the option to move." She placed the form on their tray table along with a pen. "You can sign here to acknowledge that this is voluntary." Micah stared at the form without touching it. Elijah's lips parted, unsure what to do. Rebecca added, If you prefer, I can fill it out and you just initial. We're happy to move you somewhere less visible." Micah didn't flinch. "We're not signing anything." Rebecca's voice hardened. "If you don't sign, the airline has the right to make administrative seat changes. It's within policy to reseat for the comfort and aesthetic cohesion of the premium cabin." That phrase, aesthetic cohesion, hung in the air like poison. Micah's nostrils flared, but his voice stayed level. "No," Rebecca leaned forward. "Passengers have been expressing concern. I'm offering you a way to avoid further conflict." "We haven't done anything," Elijah whispered. His eyes were glassy now, not with tears, but the kind of overwhelmed stillness that happens when someone has reached their emotional threshold. Rebecca didn't back down. "You're not being punished," she said smoothly. "You're being relocated. That's all." She picked up the form and pen, tucking them back into her folder with finality. "I'll let the crew know it's now a formal reassignment." Then, as if nothing had happened, she turned and walked away. Around them, no one said a word. No one offered comfort. No one objected. Because to object was to involve yourself, and most first-class passengers were trained to avoid inconvenience at all costs. In row 3, the executive from earlier sipped a scotch, eyes glazed. The couple across the aisle stared at their lap trays. Even Natalie, hovering near the galley, turned her back as Rebecca passed. 15 minutes later, a male attendant arrived with a polite smile and quiet voice. "We've opened 2 seats further back. Window and aisle. We'll help you gather your things." Micah didn't move. Elijah sat frozen, like someone who had been told they weren't real. "We're not going," Micah said, not loud, not defiant, just tired. The male attendant hesitated, then nodded and left. But the decision had already planted its weight in the boys' chests. And Rebecca, watching from across the galley curtain, allowed herself a silent smile. Rebecca Monroe had always believed that dominance didn't require shouting. It only took subtle, well-placed restrictions. A withheld glass of water, a delayed response, a rearranged seat. But sometimes she preferred more visible control. With the reassignment form rejected and her thinly veiled threats ignored, Rebecca decided to move to the next level of escalation. She didn't need permission. She had precedent. After all, the safety manual granted her latitude in maintaining order and decorum, especially in first class. Standing just behind the galley curtain, she pressed the intercom panel and whispered into the headset. "Lock Lavatory 1. First class only. Temporary security measure." The voice on the other end hesitated, then confirmed. With a soft click, the small green light on the lavatory door went dark. The sign changed from vacant to locked. Rebecca stepped back into the aisle with a mask of routine professionalism. A few passengers noticed but said nothing. It wasn't unusual for lavatories to be disabled for cleaning or turbulence. But the timing was too deliberate. Minutes later, Elijah shifted in his seat and leaned toward Micah, speaking quietly. "I need to use the restroom." Micah nodded and stood, letting his brother pass. Elijah limped toward the forward lavatory, glancing around cautiously. When he reached the door, he tapped the button. It didn't budge. Locked. Confused, he turned to Rebecca, who appeared beside him almost instantly, as if she had been waiting. "That lavatory is temporarily closed," she said with mock sympathy. "You'll need to use the one in the rear cabin." Elijah hesitated. "But this is our section." Rebecca leaned closer, her tone dropping just enough to stay out of earshot. "This side of the plane isn't appropriate for people with potential infections. We're taking precautions. I'm sure you understand." Elijah stiffened, eyes wide. "It's not infectious." "You already said." "I said protocol," she interrupted gently, then pointed down the aisle. "Back of the aircraft, dear." Micah, already watching from their row, stood immediately. "What's going on?" he asked. Rebecca raised her voice slightly. "Your brother's been redirected for sanitation purposes. Nothing serious. Please remain seated." Her words were crafted with surgical care, harmless on paper, but laced with implication. Elijah, cheeks burning, turned and limped slowly past row after row of silently watching passengers. His pace was slower now, more unsteady, and with each step the humiliation carved deeper into his spine. When he finally disappeared behind the curtain into economy, the cabin felt colder. Rebecca returned to the front, where a man in 1D, a distinguished gentleman with graying hair and a tailored blazer, leaned slightly toward her as she passed. "Was that really necessary?" he asked quietly. He didn't look sick. Rebecca's reply came with a practiced hush. "I understand your concern, sir, but in these times we have to be cautious. And besides," she added, lowering her voice even further, "we've had issues before with certain types slipping into premium class. Just trying to avoid misunderstandings." The man's eyes narrowed. "Certain types." Rebecca smiled, ignoring the challenge. "Off the record, sir, sometimes our guests are nervous about people who, well, don't project the right image. If anyone complains, you know how quickly rumors spread. One accusation, and suddenly everyone's a sympathizer. It's best not to get involved." He didn't respond. Rebecca took his silence as submission and moved on. At that moment, Micah stood again, this time walking briskly toward the back of the plane. She didn't stop him. She wanted him to see how far his brother had to go. When Micah reached the economy cabin, he found Elijah returning. Face pale, posture slumped. They passed in silence, brushing shoulders. Back at their row, Micah settled into a seat and turned to the window, jaw locked. Elijah followed, moving slower now, every movement a performance of suppression. Rebecca passed by again, refilling water for the couple in 3C and 3D. "Is everything all right?" she asked sweetly. "Just maintaining calm. You never know these days." The woman smiled weakly. The man sipped his drink. No one spoke up. No one asked why two well-behaved teenagers had been systematically humiliated over the course of 3 hours. That was how first class worked. Discomfort was only valid if it belonged to the powerful. In the galley, Natalie watched the exchange, her throat tight. "You locked the lavatory," she said. "You know they can file a grievance." Rebecca glanced at her with a hollow smile. "Not if no one cares to listen." And with that, she returned to the aisle, her steps light, her power absolute. Elijah had stopped speaking entirely. The boy who once hummed softly when nervous now sat rigid, eyes dull, hands still. Since being forced to walk to the back of the plane for a basic human need, Elijah hadn't spoken a full sentence. Rebecca Monroe, passing with a cloth and a spritz bottle, had made sure their tray tables were cleaned with theatrical care, spraying and wiping in sharp, exaggerated motions only when she reached their row, as though cleansing contamination. She hadn't said another word directly to them, but her presence lingered like a stain they couldn't scrub off. The real damage, however, was already done. Elijah, who once sat straight despite his limp, now curled inward slightly, shoulders hunched, eyes locked on the worn leather bag tucked beneath his feet like a shield. When turbulence rocked the plane gently, his hand instinctively reached inside the bag for something. A moment later, he pulled out a small, well-handled photograph, its edges soft from years of use. Micah turned and saw it. He hadn't realized Elijah brought the picture. Their mother, smiling, standing in front of a faded diner, one arm around each of them. It was the last photo taken before the cancer had taken her, before Elijah's limp became permanent, before the world started seeing them as baggage instead of boys. Elijah stared at the photo for several long seconds before his fingers twitched. The plane jolted again, and the photo slipped from his hand, fluttering down beside his foot. In a heartbeat, Rebecca was there, stepping in to retrieve it. "Careful," she said sweetly, bending down and picking it up with 2 fingers as if it were a used napkin. She held it up, squinting, studying the image. "Oh," she said, tilting her head. "Now it makes sense. You've had a rough start, haven't you? I suppose moments like this," she gestured to the cabin, to the seats, to the privilege, "are easier to crave when you come from less." Micah's breath caught. Elijah didn't move. His mouth twitched as if to form a word, but nothing came. Rebecca, apparently satisfied with her comment, handed the photo back and walked away, leaving behind something heavier than insult, something that could only be described as soul-deep collapse. Micah looked at his brother, and in that instant he saw it. Not fear, not anger, emptiness. Elijah's hand trembled as he slid the photo back into the bag. Micah stood abruptly, unable to hold still a second longer. His vision blurred, his throat thick, but he didn't speak. He simply walked, past the galley, past the curtain, past the invisible barrier between dignity and dismissal. In the dimness of economy, he found an empty window seat near the rear exit and sat down without a word. Passengers barely looked up. Elijah remained in 2A alone. His breathing was shaky now, his shoulders tight. Slowly, he pulled out a cracked old phone and stared at the screen. His thumb hovered for several seconds, then finally tapped a single contact labeled Uncle D. He held the phone to his ear, eyes wet but unblinking. When the call connected, he didn't wait for a greeting. "Chow can chew," he said in a low, shaking voice. "Naibaga." On the other end, the voice didn't ask why. It simply replied, "I'm on it." Elijah lowered the phone, placed it in his lap, and took a slow, steady breath. Back in first class, Rebecca noticed his stillness. She raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Micah didn't return. Natalie, standing quietly in the galley, finally found the courage to whisper, "You think maybe it's gone too far?" Rebecca didn't answer. Rebecca Monroe moved like everything was normal. She served the final round of drinks with a polished smile and steady hands, wiping away condensation from the glass stems like a stage actress finishing her performance. She hadn't seen Micah return to his seat, and at this point, she assumed he wouldn't. One down, she thought. The quiet one was always easier to isolate. Elijah, though still seated in 2A, hadn't spoken in nearly an hour. He stared straight ahead, the seatbelt tight across his waist, his expression blank but not broken. Rebecca noticed, but chose not to acknowledge it. In her mind, the situation had been handled, controlled, contained, and that was all that mattered. As she returned to the galley to finish her cabin report, her earpiece crackled with a coded alert from the ground team. She tapped the comm. "Monroe here. Go ahead." A static-laced voice came through, low and direct. "Be advised. VIP flag triggered on manifest. High tier, executive en route. Discreet inspection. Repeat, do not alter standard protocol, but be aware. Leadership presence confirmed." Rebecca rolled her eyes and muted the line with an annoyed sigh. "Wonderful," she muttered to herself. Probably another middle-aged man with a clipboard who thinks lukewarm cappuccino counts as a service violation. She didn't bother to respond to the ground crew. She had seen these so-called surprise inspections before, some out-of-touch exec playing pretend mystery shopper. She finished her checklist, tucked it into the drawer, and leaned against the galley wall, arms folded. The seatbelt sign lit up overhead. They were beginning descent. A few minutes later, the captain made his standard announcement in that calm autopilot tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly in Los Angeles. Please return to your seats and ensure your tray tables are stowed." Rebecca smiled. Her favorite part of the flight just minutes away. Landing meant closure. Landing meant no consequences. As the wheels touched down with a soft bounce, the cabin rumbled lightly, and the usual chorus of sighs and seat shuffling filled the air. Elijah didn't move. He sat still, eyes forward, hands folded in his lap. Rebecca barely glanced his way as she secured the galley, smoothed her uniform, and stepped forward to prepare the door. She practiced her arrival smile in the reflection of the metal panel beside the exit. Warm, collected, professional. She'd end the flight with the same grace she began it. When the door unlocked with a metallic hiss, she opened it with a flourish and stepped out onto the jet bridge, ready to greet the ground team. What she saw stopped her breath. The gate was silent. Lined up in perfect formation were nearly a dozen Skylux Airlines employees in full uniform, operations managers, regional directors, even ground crew, all standing still, straight-backed, eyes forward. In front of them stood a tall black man in a tailored gray suit, posture poised, expression unreadable. The moment Rebecca appeared, the entire line dropped their heads in a sharp, synchronized nod. "Good evening, Chairman," the lead director said crisply. "Your timing is impeccable." Rebecca blinked. Her smile faltered, then collapsed. The man in the gray suit stepped forward. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence rippled through the air like a pressure wave. The badge on his jacket pocket bore a silver crest she had only ever seen on official company briefings, the executive mark of the Skylux Holdings Board. He was not mid-level. He was not a clipboard carrier. He was the top. Her throat tightened as the realization hit. She turned her head slowly back toward the aircraft, just in time to see Elijah step off a plane. Behind him, Micah followed, calm, composed, and no longer broken. The two boys walked past her without a glance. But the man in gray met her eyes, and in that single gaze, everything Rebecca had done, every word, every gesture, every humiliation, replayed in her mind in horrifying clarity. She tried to speak. He raised a hand slightly, not in greeting, but in command. "We'll speak," he said quietly, his voice cool and precise. "In my office." Immediately, Rebecca's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Rebecca Monroe followed the chairman down the hallway in silence, her steps clicking against the polished airport floor that now sounded louder than ever beneath her heels. The usual confidence in her gait had vanished, replaced by tight-shouldered tension and shallow breaths. Each stride he took seemed to echo with finality, as if every second drew her closer to something irreversible. She had worked this airline for over 14 years. She had trained juniors, handled chaos, calmed angry elites, and even charmed inspectors. But now, none of that felt relevant, because the man walking 3 steps ahead of her was not just another name on a memo. He was the board-appointed chairman of Skylux Holdings, a position so high that most flight staff only heard of it in briefings or corporate rumors. And the worst part was that she still didn't know exactly why he was here, until he stopped outside a frosted glass conference room, opened the door, and gestured for her to enter. Inside sat 2 corporate legal advisors, a regional HR director, and a third man with a tablet already active. On the table lay a file with her name printed in bold across the cover. She froze for a fraction of a second, then stepped in. The chairman followed, closed the door behind them, and took his seat at the head of the table. "Miss Monroe," he began calmly, "you've worked with this airline for quite some time, haven't you?" She nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "Yes, sir. 14 years. 14, he repeated thoughtfully. "And in that time, you've maintained an above-average performance record. Stellar on paper, in fact. But records can lie, can't they?" Rebecca's lips parted. "I've always met my targets. Passenger satisfaction, compliance, timeliness. I've earned every commendation. Except the ones we never filed," he said, folding his hands. "Or the ones you had suppressed." He turned to the legal advisor, who swiped across the tablet and rotated it so Rebecca could see. On screen, 3 prior complaints from passengers regarding discriminatory treatment, coded under internal markers like "resolved informally" and "insufficient evidence for escalation." Her chest tightened. She had assumed those were buried, handled quietly by supervisors grateful for her ability to control problematic guests without needing security intervention. But here they were, brought back to life in full resolution. The HR director spoke next, voice clipped. "All 3 complaints were flagged in our ethics audit, but each time, the involved manager waived escalation due to your tenure. However, given what we observed today, those files are being formally reopened." "Observed?" Rebecca asked, voice cracking slightly. "I handled that flight professionally." "They don't," the chairman cut in sharply. "You don't know who they are, and that is precisely your mistake." His gaze darkened, and suddenly, his tone dropped into something harder. "Those 2 boys, Micah and Elijah Ellis, are my nephews. Their parents, my late sister and her husband, were part of the very reason this airline exists today. I helped build this company from the ground up while raising those boys after tragedy struck their family. This wasn't a routine flight. This was a stress test, a deliberate assessment of how our premium service responds when the guest doesn't match the image people like you have decided belongs in first class." Rebecca felt her knees weaken, her mind scrambling. "Sir, I had no idea." "Exactly," he said, cutting her off. "You had no idea, because you didn't ask. Because you didn't listen. Because you saw skin, posture, a limp, and a birthmark, and you drew a line that you've drawn before. Rebecca Monroe stood frozen in her chair, her palms sweaty against the polished conference table, her breath shallow, her mind searching desperately for an escape route that didn't exist. The legal advisor to his left tapped a few keys on the tablet and displayed a second file: public relations assessments, early media alerts, legal exposure metrics. On the screen, a projection glowed in red: reputational damage, projected loss in consumer trust, potential class action, threats from previously silenced complaints now likely to resurface. The HR director spoke with icy clarity. Effective immediately. Your employment is terminated. You are not entitled to severance, retirement match, or post-service benefits. Additionally, due to the nature and pattern of misconduct across multiple years, the board has invoked Clause 9A of your contract, willful misconduct resulting in reputational harm, which authorizes corporate countersuit to recover damages, both financial and reputational. Rebecca blinked. You're suing me? Her voice cracked, the weight of it finally breaking past her armor. After everything I've given this airline? The chairman didn't blink. You didn't give, Miss Monroe. You took. And what you took was trust, the kind our passengers are supposed to feel the moment they step onto that aircraft. You sold dignity for control. That's not service. That's rot. Her lips trembled. But they were just... I didn't know who they were. And if they hadn't been my nephews, he asked coldly, would they still have deserved the things you did to them? The comments? The humiliation? She didn't answer. Her silence was answer enough. The HR rep slid a thick manila envelope across the table. This contains the formal termination letter, lawsuit notice, and a blacklisted industry notification that will be distributed to the National Aviation Association by morning. You will not work for another airline again. Not commercial, not private, not charter, not training. Rebecca's hands hovered above the envelope, trembling, but she didn't touch it. Her mind reeled. No income, no pension, no referrals, no uniform. Her entire identity, shredded by a single flight. I want to speak with my union, she whispered, grasping at anything. The legal advisor didn't even look up. Your union has been notified. They've declined to intervene. The evidence is overwhelming, and they've already agreed to arbitration limits. Panic surged. Her mouth opened, but no words came. She stood abruptly, as if motion might outrun consequences, but the chairman stood with her, and so did the rest of the room. That alone told her it was done. She turned, dazed, and left the room with slow, mechanical steps. The hallway felt longer now, every stride echoing louder than the last. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A single message from her former supervisor, the one who had protected her 3 years ago during the second misconduct complaint. Sorry, this time I can't help you. They're making an example. She stopped walking. Her mouth went dry. The man who once swept her offenses under the rug to maintain internal harmony had turned. Her allies were gone. Every name on her contact list was now just an empty ringtone. When she reached the staff exit, she passed by a row of flight attendants from her current rotation. None of them looked at her. Natalie didn't speak. One girl who used to beg her for scheduling tips simply turned away. The silence hit harder than words ever could. Security waited at the end of the terminal, not to escort her, but to monitor her departure. Rebecca Monroe, once queen of the sky, once the gatekeeper of first class, now walked alone through the back halls of the airport she had ruled. She didn't cry. Not yet. She didn't plead or curse or explain. Because there was nothing left to say. The system that once protected her had retracted its shield, and now she felt the full weight of accountability. 2 months later, the early morning air outside Los Angeles buzzed with life, but inside a cramped diner off Melrose, everything felt muted and slow. Rebecca Monroe stood behind the counter in a faded blue uniform, her name stitched in thread barely holding. The apron around her waist bore coffee stains from the shift before, and the sink behind her was already clogged with a line of used plates. She wiped her hands on a towel and stared blankly at the register, waiting for another round of breakfast orders. Her once manicured nails were now clipped short and stained at the edges. The scent of burnt bacon and stale syrup clung to her skin like penance. She hadn't found another job in aviation. She never would. After the termination, the lawsuit, and the public release of the chairman's disciplinary transcript, no airline in North America, or beyond, would touch her. The formal statement released by Skylux Holdings was scathing, naming her actions a willful breach of ethics, human dignity, and operational integrity. Within days, civil rights groups amplified the story. Then came the wave of former passengers and ex-employees stepping forward, voices she never thought would speak. A class action lawsuit was filed, backed by a coalition of advocacy firms and private attorneys, citing patterns of abuse and systemic bias masked as policy enforcement. Rebecca tried to hide, but the internet didn't forget. Every headline bore her name. Her photo, once featured in in-flight magazines as Cabin Excellence Award recipient, was now side by side with stories of passengers degraded under her authority. She applied for jobs under a different name. Still no luck. She sold her condo, moved into a shared rental with paper-thin walls and no heating. The severance money she hoped to fight for never arrived. Her bank account held just enough to cover bus fare and late rent. Her pride, once weaponized like a blade, was now a shackle around her ankles. On that morning, as she poured coffee for a quiet table by the window, she barely noticed the screen near the kitchen flicker to a new video. The volume wasn't loud, but the voice was unmistakable, clear, composed, warm. Micah Ellis stood on a TED Talk stage, wearing a navy blazer, a steady smile beneath his sharp eyes. Elijah sat in the front row, posture straighter now, the limp still there, but unburdened by shame. "There's a difference between silence and surrender," Micah said, his voice reverberating through the diner's dusty ceiling fan. "What my brother and I learned at 30,000 feet is that endurance isn't weakness, it's strategy. And when power pretends not to see you, the best revenge is to make them hear you." The audience applauded, slowly at first, then louder, rising like a wave. Rebecca stood frozen, her hands gripping the coffee pot so tightly her knuckles blanched. Behind her, a waitress whispered, "That's those kids from the plane story, right? The ones that took down the airline executive." "No," another worker corrected. "Their uncle's the executive. They took down the flight attendant." "I heard she got blacklisted forever," someone else added. "Good." Rebecca turned away before anyone recognized her face. She dropped the coffee pot in the sink, ignored the splatter, and escaped to the back alley. Alone, she leaned against the brick wall and stared at the sky. The same sky she used to glide through every day in heels and crisp polyester. The same sky she once believed belonged to her. Now, all it offered was distance and silence. On the other side of the city, in a packed auditorium, Micah finished his speech. The closing line landed like thunder. "Respect isn't a luxury you earn with money. It's the bare minimum owed to every soul you meet. And if someone forgets that, remind them, not with rage, but with truth." As he stepped down, Elijah joined him on stage, holding up the same photograph Rebecca had once insulted. They smiled together, two brothers no longer defined by how the world had tried to shrink them. The clip went viral within hours, reaching 20 million views before sundown. Schools shared it. Activists cited it. Airlines revised training protocols because of it. The chairman, watching from a balcony seat, remained quiet. He didn't need to speak. He had already said what mattered, and the world had heard it. Meanwhile, back in the diner, Rebecca returned to the floor when the lunch crowd rolled in. She said nothing to anyone. She moved between tables with robotic grace, poured drinks, wiped counters, took orders. No one looked at her twice. No one cared what she used to be. And that, more than anything, was the sentence she never saw coming. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss more powerful narratives like this one. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the story hit you the hardest? Which moments stayed with you long after it ended? And where in the world are you watching from today? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it.